I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always are happily ever after.
Long ago and far away, where deep blue seas lap against sandy shores, there was a mild and temperate land. Among its green and rolling hills there stood a village, well fortified with wooden stockades. The village was a happy one, filled with the sound of laughing children. In this country, it was the custom for warriors to have tattoos all over their faces, and for the others who were not so brave, to have no tattoos at all. Of course, everybody wanted to be a warrior. Now, in this village there lived a very strange fellow called Nikorima, and he was different from all the other men because he had tattoos on only one side of his face. Now, the village had just been badly hit by storms. Strong winds had torn and damaged many of the huts, including Nikorima's. He tried to repair the roof, but it needed new rushes. So the men went to the chief and asked if they might go down to the river and collect rushes there. "It is a busy time of year," said the chief, "and half a day's walk to the river." "Why don't we just send 4 men?" suggested one. "They can collect rushes for all of us." The chief thought this was a very good idea. "Let's send Nikorima," chuckled the chief. The men all laughed. It was agreed that Nikorima and 3 others should set off the next morning and collect rushes for the whole village. Away went Nikorima to tell his wife. He then called several of the men whose huts had been badly hit by the storm and told them to be ready to leave at dawn. The chief had chosen Nikorima to do this job because it was the sort of unimportant task that none of the warriors would be willing to do. The next morning, as the sun rose, Nikorima and his party set off on the long walk. It was almost noon before they arrived at the hill overlooking the wide, meandering river. They were all tired, so Nikorima decided they should camp here in the clearing, as it was well protected. "You make camp," said Nikorima. "I will go down to the river and see where the best rushes are growing." And away he went down the hill towards the river, leaving the others behind. But as he was walking along by the river bank, he suddenly ducked down. There were men ahead. Nikorima did not want to be seen, for if they were men from another village, he and his party would be in danger. So he crept stealthily forward through the grass until he could see and hear them better. It was indeed a raiding party. And from what he could hear, they were on their way to attack his village, and there were more men coming to join them. Nikorima thought quickly. He knew he had to do something to protect his family and the other men. Since the raiding party were waiting for the other warriors to join them, he might just be in time if he hurried. Nikorima's son, tired of being idle, had collected some rushes. Nikorima returned to the camp and told his son to go quickly and find the other men. Then he took up the bundle of rushes his son had left and began to tie them up. His wife watched curiously. "Listen, wife," Nikorima hissed urgently. "We must work quickly. There is an enemy raiding party close at hand." His wife wondered what he was doing. It didn't take long to find out. He was making a dummy man. "Now watch carefully, for we must make many of these dummies," said Nikorima to the men. Then he draped a cloak round the dummy so it would look lifelike from a distance. The men watched as Nikorima explained exactly what to do. "Let us hope it will convince the enemy that there are more of us," said Nikorima. "Now go quickly," he said when he had finished. "Go and collect many rushes, but be very quiet and careful." Then he ordered his wife and son to return to the village, because they would be safer there and they could warn the chief and the others. The enemy chief decided that while they were waiting, he would send out a scout. Nikorima and his men worked very hard, and it wasn't long before the plain by the river bank was dotted with dummy men. Half hidden in the tall grasses, they looked like real guards. They were not a moment too soon, for the scout was advancing. He crept stealthily through the long grass. He was not really expecting to meet anyone. When suddenly he came to a clearing and saw what he thought were many guards. There must be a large enemy camp nearby. He must hurry back and tell his chief about this, quickly before the guards caught sight of his party. Away went the enemy scout back towards his camp, but Nikorima was waiting. His ambush was a success and he felled the scout to the ground. Nikorima realized that he and the scout looked alike, so he darkened his face as the scout had and made his way to the enemy camp. Nikorima reported that he'd seen many guards. There must be a large enemy force close by. They should leave quickly before they were attacked. The chief agreed that his men should go since they were heavily outnumbered. The men left, very disappointed that they had no chance to fight. Nikorima persuaded the chief not to leave yet and suggested that he showed him where the guards were, and perhaps the two of them could capture one. The chief thought this was an excellent idea. The chief was very keen to capture a guard and take him back to his village. But just as he was about to spring up and capture one, Nikorima gave a loud war cry, and before the chief knew what had happened, he had been surrounded. He was very angry. He had been tricked. Nikorima and his party returned the next morning to their village, leading the captured chief. Nikorima marched him proudly up to the chief's hut. All the men of the village stared in surprise. How had Nikorima managed such a clever feat? The chief of the village was curious too. "How did you capture him?" he asked. "Oh, it was all due to the rushes," said Nikorima airily. The chief was rather puzzled, but said nothing. The enemy chief was now completely disgraced. And throwing down his tiki, he was allowed to leave. He could not return to his own village because of his disgrace. He was now an outcast, but his heart was already set on revenge. He would get his own back on Nikorima and his village. But Nikorima knew nothing of this. He was rather enjoying being a hero for a change. Now, because of Nikorima's bravery, the chief decided to leave him in charge of the women and children, while all the other men went off for 2 days hunting. The chief had not completely changed his opinion of Nikorima and still thought him rather odd. But Nikorima was very happy to be left to defend the village, and he stood proudly on guard. Little did Nikorima know that the enemy chief he had captured a few days before was at this very moment creeping towards the village with a band of ruthless outcasts. He had promised them the rich pickings of the village if they helped him capture it. Luckily, the enemy chief had not seen the chief of the village leave with his men, so he had no way of knowing how many warriors there were in the village. Nikorima soon caught sight of them as they crept through the long grass in the shallow valley that surrounded the village. The first thing he did was to bang the warning drum very hard, though he knew his chief would be too far away to hear. Nikorima's wife and son heard the noise and wondered what could be wrong. The enemy chief wasn't going to be put off by one warrior, so he sent off a scout to look. Nikorima ran to his hut. He told his son to go and keep watch, and then asked his wife to collect together as many weapons and cloaks as she could find. Then he hurried out of the stockade and began a war dance. The scout watched Nikorima doing his wild dance and did not dare come any closer, for that would mean he had accepted the challenge. Nikorima jumped and threatened. Truly he was a fierce warrior. But he made sure he only showed the tattooed side of his face to the scout. As Nikorima danced more and more wildly, the scout took fright and fled. He returned shaking and told of this fierce and terrible warrior with a tattooed face guarding the village. But the chief was not so easily put off, and he decided that he would send 2 more scouts to spy out the village, for he must know exactly how many warriors there were before he attacked. Away went the scouts, and it wasn't long before one of them had spied Nikorima coming out of the stockade. Here is another fierce warrior guard, thought the scout as he watched in awe. But this one was much fiercer than the other one the scout had seen, and he had no tattoos on his face either. See how he wildly drummed his feet. The scout was very impressed and frightened by Nikorima's wild performance. As soon as Nikorima saw the scout slink off, he hurried back to the compound where the women were waiting, greatly relieved that Nikorima had so far been able to hold off the enemy. His son kept guard as Nikorima covered the untattooed side of his face with black paint. The enemy must not think he was the same warrior. In the meantime, the chief had heard the news of the second bold warrior, but he still would not leave. He would wait to hear what the other scouts said. In no time, Nikorima was up on the lookout post, wearing a cloak and with his face blackened. He looked very fierce indeed, and not at all like the other guards. He danced and danced. The scout grew quite dizzy just watching him. Here was the third and fiercest of the warrior guards. Surely the chief would now leave the village alone. The scout had no great wish to fight these fearsome men. He thought he would creep round to the other side of the village. The chief, meanwhile, had grown impatient and sent another man to see what had happened. The scout had crept round to the other side of the village. Nikorima was ready for him, this time without a cloak and carrying a spear. Again he danced and danced, faster and faster, putting great fear into the heart of the scout who was hiding in the bushes. Here was the boldest of the guards. He must return to the chief and tell him that with 4 such bold guards, they should not attack the village. By now, the scout was so frightened by Nikorima's wild dance that he fled through the grass and back to his camp. The scout described the 2 bold warrior guards, how fierce and dangerous they looked. But the chief was still in no mood to listen. Meanwhile, Nikorima was changing his disguise again, for he was sure that the chief would send out another scout. He was beginning to feel very tired, but he knew he couldn't stop. And sure enough, his son came to tell him that another scout had been sighted. out came Nikorima once more and more fiercely he danced, for he knew the whole village depended on him and he could not let them down. The scout watched in awe. Here was another warrior, fiercer than the rest that the other scouts had described. He would skirt round to the next gate and see how many more there were. Nikorima barely had time to change his weapons before he had to appear as the sixth warrior. Faster and faster he danced. How he jumped and lunged. The scout was spellbound. Never in his whole life had he seen a warrior as fierce as this. How fierce and deadly this warrior would be in battle. The others were bold, but none could compare with him. Faster and faster went his feet as he jumped and danced. By now, Nikorima was beginning to feel very tired, but he knew he must not stop, so he danced on. It was the scout who broke first. He was so frightened of Nikorima's wild dance that he fled back to the camp. But still the chief would not listen, and he sent yet another scout to the village. Nikorima by now was beginning to think that his strength would not last. But for the sake of the women and children, he just had to keep going. He could not afford to fail. So again he danced, jumping, whirling, dipping and twisting. And as he danced, the scout watched with a mixture of fear and fascination. The scout had no wish to engage in battle with him. This was the seventh, and by far the fiercest of all the warriors. The scout fled, just like the others, back to the chief, crying that they could not stay and fight, for he had just seen the seventh and fiercest of all the guards. They would never capture the village. But the chief would not listen. He called them men of little courage. His pride and wish for revenge made him insist that they should attack. He would himself go and see these warriors of whom they were so terrified. He would show them what cowards they all were. Nikorima's son, who was on guard, saw the chief creeping towards the village and ran to tell his father. Now Nikorima had been expecting the chief to come himself in the end, and he knew he must disguise himself very well, so he covered his face in red mud while the women watched. The chief was almost at the gates of the village when not a moment too soon Nikorima came running out. The chief had the shock of his life, for he had not expected this. He was no match for this wild warrior. The chief ran back through the forest and did not stop until he came to where his men were waiting. He told them that he had decided after all not to attack the village and that they should leave at once. Nikorima watched with great satisfaction and relief as he saw the chief and his men creep away through the undergrowth. He had saved the village. He went back to his hut to rest because by now he was very tired. His son was very eager to talk to his father, but Nikorima's wife knew that her husband was exhausted, so she shooed him away. It was noon the next day when the men of the village returned. They had not been very successful in their foraging for food and were glad to be home. The women came out to greet them and quickly told them of what had happened, how the village had been threatened by an enemy force, and how Nikorima had held them off single-handed. The chief was astonished when he heard their story and was eager to see Nikorima. Meanwhile, Nikorima's son had gone to the hut to tell his father of the chief's return. Nikorima came hurrying out, eager to tell them all what had happened. The whole village was waiting for him, and the chief rose to greet him. Nikorima happily explained that he had kept the enemy at bay by pretending to be 8 different warriors, and how by dancing at each different gate of the village, he had managed to fool the scouts and convince them that there were many bold warriors there. The chief listened very intently as Nikorima showed them how he danced and frightened all the scouts. Everybody was most impressed. Nikorima had saved their village for the 2nd time in a week. The chief wished to pay Nikorima the highest compliment he could for his bravery, so he removed his own feathers from his head and presented them to him. Nikorima's son watched proudly. His father was now truly a hero. As the chief presented the feathers to him, he said, "Nikorima, the whole village thanks you." "Thank you, O chief," said Nikorima, quite overcome by the honor. It was decreed that a feast should be held that evening to celebrate, and no one ever laughed at Nikorima again.